Thanks for joining us. My name is Brian Elaine. I'm here today with our friend Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, who built his ministry on community empowerment and social justice activism. As senior pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, Dr. Moss spent the last 2 decades practicing and preaching a Black theology that unapologetically calls attention to the problems of mass incarceration, environmental justice, and economic apartheid. Hailed as one of the 12 most effective preachers in the English-speaking world by Baylor University's George W. Truett Theological Seminary, he's been cited by Chicago Magazine as one of the city's 30 most influential people. He's an NAACP Image Award recipient, award-winning filmmaker, poet, and professor of homiletics at Mercer University's McAfee School of Theology. He's married to Monica Brown, and they are the proud parents of 2 kids. We're here today to talk about his new book, Dancing in the Darkness, Spiritual Lessons for Thriving in Turbulent Times from Simon & Schuster. And you can learn more about Otis and all of his work at trinitychicago.org. So welcome, Otis. It's wonderful to speak with you again, and congratulations on all your accomplishments.
Brian, thank you very much for having me back. It's good to have this conversation with you.
Well, same here. I've always so respected all of your work, and it's always just great to catch up on what the latest is. So before we get into books, though, maybe you could start off a little bit more about your background and particularly your filmmaking, because I'm not sure a lot of our audience may not be aware of that.
I appreciate you asking that question, allowing me to expound on one of my loves being filmmaking. I did not intend to go into ministry as a young child. I wanted to be a filmmaker, specifically a cinematographer. That was my interest. And when I went to Morehouse, I was going to declare as being a filmmaker, took film classes, had student films. I was planning to go to NYU and Union Theological Seminary. That's what I wanted. There were no joint programs, but I was hoping that I could take the documentary program at Union and somehow figure out how to be at New York University, I'm sorry. And also figure out how I could complete an MDiv or an MA at Union Theological Seminary. Didn't quite work out that way. I ended up at Yale Divinity School because I was just looking at how do I do graduate school with no debt was my main question. But I always had the filmmaking bug in my spirit. And I had made these student films, and I was a lover of everybody from Spike Lee to Akira Kurosawa to Martin Scorsese to the French New Wave. I was a lover of of these films, and I believe that was the way to help transform people's imagination. That people have been marginalized. Our imagination has also been marginalized. And for those who are in power, their imagination has been marginalized because we view our life and individuals in a very truncated way. And watching films, I realized that, man, your imagination is expanded. When I saw Spike Lee's School Days, that was one of the reasons that I wanted to go to Morehouse College, even though my father had been there. But when I saw all the expression of this beautiful, wonderful tapestry of Blackness, I said, oh, I want to go there. And I believe that if we're going to decolonize our minds, we have to connect images, sound, and music in order to change the way that we see the world.
I'm sure you've often thought about this, but can you imagine when you were young if you had a video recorder in your palm of your hand?
Oh my gosh! There would have been movies left and right. And I had a video recorder I had to put on my shoulder, with a videotape, and I'm making movies then. But if I had just a phone, I would have multiple movies in high school. I mean, most of the movies I was making were like kung fu movies and were comedies, and I would do some documentaries. Interestingly enough, I would just want to record elders in my family and in my community to hear their stories.
Well, I mean, it leads to an explosion of possibility, right? For generating content that couldn't have been generated, right? I mean, in decades past, which is exciting, right? I mean,
it really is. There's so many ways to create content and have platforms for content. So the film that we've done several films, but the film that has really become incredibly popular is Otis's Dream.
Yes. Yeah.
Story of my grandfather in 1946 attempting to vote. It's a short film. It's a free film. Anyone can get the film at otisdream.com. It was used in the election, the campaign for Senator Raphael Warnock, as he had he was on the ballot 5 times in Georgia. But it tells a wonderful story of my grandfather's unsuccessful attempt to vote, and it gives a glimpse into my father's life, that he was inspired and given the charge by his single father, raising 5 children, to be a part of this developing freedom movement.
Hmm. Well, it's a great movie, and I was so excited when it got so much recognition. So thank you, or thank you,
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really,
congratulations.
really proud of it and proud of the team. It's like so
Yeah,
far 18 awards for this little film in 2 different countries. So from the
excellent.
UK to the United States, we've received 18 film awards in film festivals across the United States.
So we recently celebrated the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and your families, go way back. So can you just share with a little folks about the connection between your family and his?
Absolutely. Both my mother and my father were a part of the freedom movement. My father was one of the architect planners of what was known as the Atlanta Student Movement, which had a more formal name called the Movement for Human Rights, which literally desegregated the city of Atlanta. And so he was a part of that movement, and then later joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and became a lieutenant and eventually on the board for the SCLC, which was founded by Dr. King. My mother was the office manager for the Southern Christian Leadership
I
Conference.
didn't realize that.
And both of them were involved in the movement. And Dr. King did the nuptials for my parents. And the wedding photos are photos of literally the brain trust of the civil
Wow.
rights movement. I actually have a picture sitting over here of 1966 when my parents had a surprise engagement party that was thrown by Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King Jr. And in the picture, you have Hosea Williams, Andrew Young, Fred Shuttlesworth, and Bob and Letty Green. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's just like everybody in the same place. And it was a retreat for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But here's the other thing for people who are real historians. They were planning the Poor People's Campaign.
Really?
So they were,
Wow.
so they were on the edge of this Poor People's Campaign piece. Dr. King was about to move to Chicago
Mm-hmm.
to deal with the issues of housing and housing discrimination. And they throw this party for my parents in
Wow.
1966 at the Eden Rock Hotel in Miami, Florida.
Oh my goodness. How cool. History's just amazing, isn't it?
It really is.
So we will eventually get to your new book, but can you just for a minute tell folks about some of your previous books?
Sure. My previous book was the Blue Note Gospel, or Blue Note Preaching. Preaching that focuses on the blues narrative in preaching. It was from 3 lectures that I did at Yale that was known as the Beecher Lecture
Yes.
Series, which is a wonderful lecture series on preaching that's been around since, I want to say about since the turn of the century. I think it's the oldest lectureship in preaching.
Hmm.
And I still think I was thinking I was the youngest person ever to do the lectures.
Hmm.
And we turned that into a book that takes the lectures and then also sermons that talks about the necessity to be able to face tragedy, but not fall into despair, by looking at the blues narrative coming out of the African-American tradition, and that prophetic preaching for Black people has been preaching that is unafraid of the blues, that takes the blues America has given us and makes it into a song.
Hmm.
And so that's what the framework of that book is. Then we had a book of my father and myself. We had a book of collected sermons that entitled Preach, the Power and Purpose Behind Our Praise, and did also a collection entitled The Gospel According to the Wiz. Not the Wizard of Oz, but the Wiz. The Wiz was the musical that was created, an African-American version
Right,
of the
right.
Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
And we did series of messages that focus on different characters in that book. Actually, there was kind of a labor of love on that one because we did
Sure.
a Trinity focused on those ideas, dealing with the scarecrow, that what is already in you, having someone, a road dog like Toto in your life, and and the fact that there are some people behind the curtain, the wizard, that really have no power. So it was a lot of fun. And then I actually have an essay in there that talk about the power of film and the history of film.
Mm.
It's kind of a combination of that piece. And then there was another piece we did a few years ago in collection with several other ministers called the Gospel Remix.
Mm.
That how to reach the hip hop generation. It was
Mm.
4 pastors writing from 4 different perspectives on that, along with a scholar, Ralph Watkins, who teaches at Columbia Theological Seminary. And my very first book was one that I self-published in Augusta, Georgia, entitled Redemption in a Red Light District.
Mm. I don't remember that one.
Well, it was a self-published book, so it's like it's like whatever we had, we just sold and passed
Sure,
out.
sure.
That was my first foray into quote publishing, doing the cover and everything, and the graphic design and all of that, and it was a lot of fun. But that the sermon was focused on that wonderful sister who was in Jericho,
Mm.
and she was in the red light district, and her power and her veracity of being able literally to open the door for possibilities for the children of Israel.
So let's get to the new one, the new book. The title is Dancing in the Darkness, Spiritual
Yes,
Lessons for Thriving in Turbulent Times. So what's the main theme of this book and what motivated you to write it?
sure. Um, the main theme is really the focus on this idea of linking love and justice together, and how we do that personally and also in the public square. The impetus for the book came through looking and experiencing the fact that so many, not only congregation in Chicago and places that I travel, that there's a spiritual itch that people are trying to scratch, and whatever they ingest or engage in does not seem to scratch that particular itch, that they find themselves spiritually anemic afterwards. And maybe in social media network, it may be money, whatever it is. And going back to these spiritual values of linking love and justice, learning how to consecrate your chaos, how to redirect your rage, the power of grace known as pardoning our dust, and knowing that there is redemption instead of retribution, and then looking at how do we grieve in a prophetic way, especially in a challenging moment. And then the title of the book is How Do We Learn How to Dance in the Darkness?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So being a marketing person, I have to ask you this question. Who is the intended audience for the book?
Oh, well, that's great. The intended audience is several sectors, I should say. You have your church audience, but here's the thing: this is not a churchy book at all, and that's what's really fascinating. From my agnostic and atheist friends, they are so appreciative
Hmm.
of a book that clearly communicates, yes, your spiritual values, but I can engage this and look at this from my particular framework, say from a secular side. I engage these values, and so it's intended for those who are committed and believe that there are certain values that we need to thrive. And it is shared through the lens of Black spirituality.
Hmm. So here's a portion of the book's description. It says, Dancing in the Darkness is a life-affirming guide to the practical, political, and spiritual challenges of our day. This collection helps us tap the spiritual reserves we all possess, but too often overlook, so we can slay our personal demon, confront our civic challenges, and reach our highest goals. So would you say that the book focuses more on describing the challenges or offering means to address
Both. It describes the challenges and then gives you a mean to engage them. It deals with the trauma that we all will experience, and then raises the question of how do you engage this so that you can thrive, not survive. That's a big thing for me. Survival culture is dangerous because it just teaches you how to tread water.
Hmm.
We want you to learn how to do the breaststroke, backstroke, everything else so that you can get to a new destination and not just wait for somebody to come and save you in the water. And so
No, I mean, can you give us an example of one of the more practical things that you
yeah.
suggest?
Yeah, we talk about there's a wonderful chapter in there, a very painful chapter, but a wonderful chapter entitled "Redirect Our Rage" that tells the story of the murder of one of our young people in our church, and how many of our young people want to take justice into their own hands, and how we had to respond as a community of helping them to redirect their rage and focus on restorative aspects so that they could empower their community. And so they put together a Kickstarter campaign. Teenagers, we didn't. They raised $12,000 for, if you have information, to the killer. We put them in peace circles so they could talk about the deep pain and trauma that they've experienced of people that they have lost in their community.
Hmm.
And then they started raising questions about what can we do? What movement can we be a part of to reduce violence in our community? So we wanted to give them practical aspects. And that tells the story. It's a true story of what happened to us and how we engaged the issue of redirecting our rage so that we could empower versus being held by the pain of a moment.
Hmm. I think that that's really valuable. There's a lot of justified rage out there, a lot of
Mm,
justified anger of
mm,
all kinds of things that have happened in our past and in our present. Um, and I know there are, friends of mine, particularly people of color, that have struggled with that, with what do they do with their rage. And, one of our mutual friends, Frank Thomas,
mhm,
has spoken about that at a couple of my conferences.
mm,
And, he uses writing, as one of, he said, I write to stay sane. I think is his
mm,
quote, along
mhm.
those lines. So, I'm glad to see you adding to the reinforcement of that need and solutions to that issue.
Yes.
So I'd like to read a couple of the reviews of the book. This one comes from Book List. His carefully developed messages bring, excuse me, let me start that over. His carefully developed messages build logically, and his words of inspiration seem fresh and attuned to present realities. Moss's advice to dance in the dark is timely and hints at a brighter tomorrow. So I'm particularly drawn to the statement, his carefully developed messages build logically. Um, can you give me an example of how you've done that?
That's an interesting question. For example, the book, the section on prophetic grief. So I start with talking about Dylan Roof
Mm,
and the rage and the pain and the trauma of the act and how collectively as a nation, we were like, hey, we want Dylan Roof in prison. We want Dylan Roof executed, whatever it is. And then you have a group of people who appear on the news that say, we forgive you. And then it throws things into a complete chaos in terms of conversation.
mm,
And America doesn't really understand the type of forgiveness that these families were talking about. We're not talking about forgetting or removing accountability. They were specifically talking about Dylan Roof will not hold residence in my soul.
yeah, yeah.
That's what they were talking about. That's
Mhm.
very different than this other strange forgiveness. I really don't understand that other strange forgiveness that people talk about, this forgiving and forgetting and everything is okay. They were saying, we're going to hold you accountable. And we are going to grieve prophetically, meaning we are now going to work to make sure that Dylan roofs are not continuing to be created. And so I lay out the fact that we're comfortable with Dylan Roof being a villain, but we don't want to deal with the system that created Dylan
Yeah,
Roof.
exactly.
And so we walk through the idea that Dylan Roof is from from the South Carolina and Charleston area, and go through a little bit of the history of that particular area. And then the South Carolina is part of the South, a little bit of history and reference to that. But instead of those who are in the North saying, yes, it's those Southerners, that the South is also connected to the North and to this wider nation that feeds the Dylan Roofs of our world. And so we have to be committed to removing the system, or I think I use the phrase that we got to remove the food system that feeds and gives nutrients to people like Dylan Roof.
Amen. Amen. So here's another blurb. This one's from Kirkus. It says, positive, hopeful, and affirming. Those sound like surprising terms, given the difficult issues that you're addressing. How did you achieve that?
I've had that question asked a couple of times. Like, how do you do this? It's like, because you're dealing with some really difficult and in some cases very horrific and painful. I believe that on one level, it is, if you are a person committed to the gospel, and I'm a person who comes out of this Black spiritual tradition that is unafraid of the blues, and the blues has never been something that causes you to fall into despair and cynicism, but just dares to assess your existential experience, and still in the back of your spirit, you have this eschatological hope. And when we examine the experience that is tragic, that can be painful, but some of the most incredibly joyous, delightful, creative, and imaginative moments in American history and in our own personal lives. I mean, I share the story about jazz music, how jazz music in itself is an act of resistance. The song Amazing Grace, and then these incredible people in our history. I talk about the beauty of Auburn Avenue and what it produced before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Became this amazing prophetic icon. That within the stories, especially of people of African descent, there are truly miraculous moments of overcoming circumstances that sociologists will say it's not possible for a people to overcome this, but yet we do. And so my hope is seen through history and all of the possibilities that are given to us through that history. And my hope is also rooted in the power of our ancestors and our faith tradition.
Well, you've done an amazing job of helping everyone make lemonade out of lemons. So looking forward, I mean, are there any future books or films that
there are both?
Tell us about.
You asking that. Yeah.
Excellent.
So I have actually a 2-book deal with Simon and Schuster.
Good.
And I negotiated. This was just a little bit of I was hustling. So when they offered, there was a couple of publishers that were looking at the possibility of publishing this. And I said, hey, would you consider a graphic novel? I'm a comic book person. And they were the publisher that agreed. They said, you sign with us, we will also sign you to do a graphic novel.
Wow.
So the graphic novel that will be coming out, that's entitled Red Clay. And Red Clay is about these twins, one by the name of Just, short for Justice, and the other by the name of Love. And they're traveling down south to see their grandmother, who is about to be lifted up as a deacon, not deaconess, deacon emeritus. But on that encounter, something happens that activates some ancient powers in them, and they go on an incredible journey where they literally learn how to live out their names.
Wow. So graphic novels.
Yeah.
A lot different, right? Than
very different. Very
just different. A textbook. I mean, a textual book.
Right.
How did that idea, come about?
I've loved comic books since I was small. I've been taking my children are grown now, but we used to go to Comic-Con all the
Oh
time.
yeah. Okay.
All the time. And my son, he started out, he fell in love with comic books. And then my daughter, who has learning differences, and she's an artist, and I would take her when she was small because I wanted her to see comic books that had brown and black young women in them, so she could see herself doing this kind of work. And the beautiful thing about Comic-Con is comic book artists and people, they're nerds. We're all nerds. And but they love talking to children who are interested in the art, and they will talk to them not like, "Oh, it's nice, little kid here. It's so nice that you came by." They will ask questions and say, "Do you have any? Can I see your portfolio? Did you bring any
Wow.
pictures with me? Let me show you how to draw a hand differently."
Huh.
You get that kind of experience. They will spend
Wow.
that kind of time with a young person. There, other places you go, you don't have
Sure.
an artist that will, engage a young person in that. And they'll just tell you, well, someone engaged me in the same way.
Mm. Hmm.
And I had the opportunity to talk with comic book writers. They said, hey, I'm not an artist, but I'm a writer. And I started thinking, I've got a few stories in me. So it was just a dream. And this is just a season where God has been allowing me to live out some of my artistic
I guess
aspects.
the different elements of creativity, Otis, that you exhibit is just really impressive, quite frankly. I mean, most people can't do one of those well. I mean, much less five. So I was fortunate to hear you speak a couple of years ago at Chautauqua. So do you have any upcoming speaking engagements that you want to share with people too?
I do. I'll be at Howard University at the end of this month. I'll be at the St. Louis branch library for it's like a book weeks talking about the book. I'll be at the DC public library in February. And then Black this a lot. I have to look it up. There's a whole bunch of different things in Black History Month where I'm speaking. But I'll be at Trinity every Sunday.
The true pastor.
Yeah, preaching. I think I just got one where I'm out on a Sunday. I usually don't go out on Sundays very often, but it's usually during the week if I'm going to be speaking. I'll be in Mississippi at the Civil Rights Museum in Mississippi in February. Reverend Tony Montgomery has organized that gathering, and just looking forward to, and of course, Festival of Homiletics. That'll be at the Festival of
Okay.
Homiletics. Yeah, looking
Good.
forward to that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Otis, for all the incredible work that you do and for joining us to share a little bit about that today. And again, the title of his new book is Dancing in the Darkness, Spiritual Lessons for Thriving in Turbulent Times. Go check out trinitychicago.org to see all the great work that Otis is doing. And please keep us in touch, with all the latest as things come out.
Certainly will. Thank you very much, Brian. Appreciate everything.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thanks so much.